The Juneau World Affairs Council presents The Middle East on Edge, assessing the prospects for a regional war with Professor Steve Niva. There is growing fear of a wider war across the Middle East, but the truth is that a low-level war is already here. Evergreen State College international politics professor Steve Niva will go over flashpoints across the region and assess the prospects for a major escalation into regional war, paying particular attention to U.S. military deployments and policy aims, and how regional de-escalation could take place. Niva holds a Ph.D. in political science and Middle East studies from Columbia University, and frequently writes and speaks about the dynamics of war and conflict in the Middle East. He has lived and worked across the Middle East and frequently takes students on study abroad programs to Egypt, Turkey, and Morocco.
Well, thank you very much for being here. Thank you to Juneau World Affairs Council for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I'm someone who comes from the Northwest in the Seattle area, and I've never been to Alaska, and this is my first time. So I'm super excited, and I'm making my plans to return. If you want me to speak up more at any time, please let me know. All right, let's get started. So, here we are on September 25th, and as I'm sure most of you are aware, we're coming up to the tragic one-year anniversary of the October 7th attack on Israel by the militant Islamist group Hamas, and then the subsequent Israeli war in Gaza that's taken place over the past year. As most of you will recall, Hamas shockingly and surprisingly broke through the siege that had been in place around Gaza for the last 20 years and made its way into southern Israel and raided and attacked a number of villages and towns, committing a number of massacres along the way, and finally bringing back 250 hostages back into Gaza. In the subsequent weeks, Israel decided upon a maximalist response. They had a variety of options, but they chose probably the strongest one, and has waged what's really amounted to a total war inside of Gaza in order, from their perspective, to eradicate Hamas. They've destroyed at least 70% of the built environment, forcibly removed about 2 million people to the southern part of Gaza, and have killed a large number of Hamas fighters, but have also killed a large number of civilians. And it's become a very controversial war. I'm sure you're all aware of that. It's been in the news. It's been debated. And it will not be the primary focus of our conversation tonight. However, it is the primary background to why we're talking about what I will be talking about. The U.S. has also been involved as a strong ally and supporter of Israel and its war in Gaza. Although more recently it's decided to push for some form of a ceasefire to end the war, and that's an ongoing issue that we'll talk about later. So while this has been an ongoing war, I would say an ongoing hot war, a total war, that's consumed our attention. What's less well known is right around the same time, exactly within weeks of the Hamas attack, there's also been a second war in which a number of actors around the region, states, militias, non-state actors, who are supportive of Palestinians, who are opposed to Israel and U.S. policy, and who are in favor of ending the war in Gaza as soon as possible, have waged what we call a limited war, a pressure campaign against Israel and the United States. A five-front war in which these groups are attempting to raise the stakes, to put pressure on Israel or the United States to end the war in Gaza. So this is the second war, kind of a shadow war, and it's taken place in the countries of Lebanon, on the Lebanese-Israel border, in Syria and Iraq. It's had to do with Iran, and also down in Yemen. And these are going to be the fronts that I'm going to talk about tonight and sort of explain and lead up to the present. Now, I said that they've been involved in a limited war, and this is sort of military technology. A limited war would be when two opponents basically are not using their full capabilities. They're not going for total destruction. Rather, they wage a war against one another where they keep the conflict in a certain parameter. There's a certain threshold. There's red lines that exist, and they work within there to try and influence each other. That's basically what's happened in the Second War. I wouldn't say the same in the First War. Israel chose not to do a completely limited war. Had I given this talk a month ago when I was invited to speak, I was actually going to make the ironic thesis that although many people think the Middle East has irrational actors, is driven by religious passion, and so on and so forth, that, hey, guess what? This limited war is actually held because the actors themselves had cost-benefit calculations of why not to cross the red line in each case, of why not to escalate and lead to a broader regional war. But given what's happened over the last month, I've had to change my thesis and rewrite the script. Because unfortunately, what we're seeing right now is that one of the actors, and I'm being absolutely analytical with you tonight, that's the nature of this talk, one of these actors, actually it's Israel, has decided it's time to change the equation. They have decided that the limited war is no longer working for them, and they have taken steps to escalate, and now we're on the brink of what possibly could be something going beyond limited war into a broader regional war or not. And this is what I'm going to talk about near the end, is try and explain why that's happening, what are the stakes, what are the strategies and goals, okay? So, and this conflict's changing day by day. If you hear something, tell me later after the talk. If something I said is no longer correct, let me know. All right. So let's go over the context here. I want you to take a look at the maps, understand what's going on. We have a five-front war. We have a limited war going on. Well, we had, so I'll be using past tense. We had a limited war going on between a group called Hezbollah in Lebanon against Israel on the border of Israel and Lebanon. We have ongoing campaigns between various militias and groups in Syria and in Iraq against primarily American targets and American forces. Iran plays a big role with all of these groups. We'll talk about that in more depth. And then in Yemen, a country that probably many people don't know a lot about, there's actually a group down there I'll explain more called the Houthis, who have been engaged in attacks on global shipping, particularly shipping that they believe might be going to Israel, as part of their attempt to put pressure on the United States, the international community, and Israel to stop the war. So these are going to be the five fronts I'm going to talk about, and then we'll get back up to the present moment. So let's start first with Lebanon, because this is what's in the news now, and I'm going to give you the background here, and then we'll work our way through the different fronts. So the story in Lebanon and the Lebanese is at the Lebanese border. And basically, the primary actor in Lebanon is a group called Hezbollah. In Arabic, Hezb is party and Allah is God. So Hezbollah, Party of God, would be the name of the organization. And their leader is Hassan Nasrallah, widely seen as one of the shrewdest tactical, strategic sort of thinkers amongst the various radical groups in the Middle East. And Hezbollah is a very interesting group. They were formed actually against Israel to begin with, after 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon in order to drive the PLO, actually the main Palestinian organization, out of Lebanon. If you know your history, you'll know what I'm talking about. And at first, actually, Hezbollah is primarily made up of Shia Muslims. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit, but in Islamic history, all you need to know, this is the thumbnail sketch, is that two of the main branches in the Islamic faith tradition are the Sunni and the Shia. There are others as well. You know, Christian tradition, you would have Protestant or Catholic, Jewish tradition, you could have Reformist and Orthodox. Do you see what I'm getting at? It's just different aspects of the faith tradition. The Shia trace themselves back to the family lineage of the Prophet Muhammad through his daughter Fatima and his nephew Ali. Shiite Ali comes from Ali. And the Sunni tradition actually traces themselves back to the companions of the Prophet, the Sunnah, the people around the Prophet. And the question was, who should lead the community after the Prophet dies? And it turned out that his companions, his right-hand man, Abu Bakr, did. So they're called the Sunnah. So do you see the distinction there? It's those who trace back to this particular schism within the Islamic tradition. It's way more complicated than that. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't get along. But what's important for us to know here, before I go further, is that Hamas, the group amongst Palestinians, is actually Sunni, which would be the same as Al-Qaeda or ISIS. They're not the same, but I just locating this. Or the majority of Muslims around the world are Sunni, and they have very different positions amongst themselves. Whereas Hezbollah comes from the Shia tradition, which is more associated with Iran. Okay, sorry for that little segue, but you'll see how this matters in the longer run. So Hezbollah is primarily Shia of Lebanon, and after experiencing Israeli occupation, they turned on Israel and created a militia and eventually drove Israel out of Lebanon. It took about 20 plus years to do, and they're the first and probably only Arab political force that has ever defeated Israel in battle. Hezbollah has become probably the world's most potent military non-state actor. They have about 40 to 50,000 men in arms. They have very sophisticated strategies, tactics, and training. They have about 150,000 missiles, ballistic missiles, and so on, most of which they get from Iran and elsewhere. They're an incredibly powerful organization. They center themselves in these parts of Lebanon, down in the border, in the Bekaa Valley up on the top. Here, this is Bekaa Valley. This is around Beirut, in Dahia it's called. It's a neighborhood in the south, and along the border area. I've been to many of these areas a number of times. My wife and I vacationed in Bekaa once. Long stories, but here's the deal. They have capabilities which they have been building for many years that if they decided to unleash could actually strike deep within Israel. Of course, they'd have to get past Israeli defenses and so on and so forth, Iron Dome and these other defenses, but a significant actor. So since October 7th, what's happened is that Hezbollah, in solidarity with Palestinians and with Hamas, although they have tension with Hamas, but they've buried their hatchets, basically started to put heat on the Israeli border as to create a second front to support those Palestinians in Gaza. This was their strategy. And they started to fire small mortars and other shells over the border at the towns, the Israeli towns in the northern part of Israel, and Israel would respond back. And basically this tit for tat escalated into a limited war where about 70,000 Israeli civilians have now moved 20 miles from the border south, and about 100,000 Lebanese civilians have moved about 20 or 25 miles from the border. And so this is an ongoing issue between them, has been this population transfer. I'm not sure how much you guys are aware of that, but that was a significant aspect. But there was always these sort of red lines that weren't to be crossed. Hezbollah rarely ever targeted Israeli civilians, and Israel's attacks were primarily on Hezbollah operatives or suspected Hezbollah operatives. There's been ongoing negotiations between where the United States and France have been trying to get some sort of deal on the border to allow for the populations to return. But Hezbollah has been very clear. We won't allow Israelis to return to the border until the Gaza war is over. This is what Nasrallah has said over and over again. He's a very interesting figure. You can look him up, watch his speeches sometime. But usually he says what he means, and he means what he says. Let's move to the next context. That's Nasrallah. The second front that we need to talk about is in Yemen. And this is this kind of obscure group that many people didn't know about until more recently, called the Houthis, because that's their family clan name. They call themselves Ansar Allah, which means the helpers of God. So kind of an abstract name for them, but that's their party name. So they're kind of a sectarian party that comes out of the north of Yemen. That's where they're from. And they're Zaydi Muslims, which is a kind of version of Shia Muslim. But really, they're sort of the backwoodsmen of Yemen. They're the up country, the hill people. And basically, during the civil war that happened after the Arab Spring, when you remember the large uprisings all around the Middle East, Yemen had an Arab Spring because they had a corrupt dictator that was ruling them, like much of the other countries in the region. And They ended up taking over Sana'a, the capital, and tried to take over the country as a party. And within a few years, the Saudis, who were north of Yemen, decided they wanted to put an end to Houthi rule, and they launched a war that the United States backed for quite a while to try and drive the Houthis out. And it was a brutal civil war, and it's a terrible humanitarian crisis in Yemen. But the point I want to make here is that during this war, the Houthis became very sophisticated in a military sense. They have rockets, they have launchers, they have drones, they have all kinds of things. And that's their leader here, Abdul Malik al-Houthi. And after October 7th, and once the war in Gaza started, they said, we are standing with Palestinians. We are going to stop shipping that goes to Israel. We're going to cut off their supplies. And if needed, we will attack Israel in order to get this war to stop. And again, when the Houthis say something, they're not. The Saudis tried to destroy, Saudis and the UAE tried to destroy them for many years, and they're very difficult to deter. They're a pretty determined group. So what they did was they started to attack shipping. They've sunk a number of ships. They've caused about 50% of global traffic to go around the Red Sea. They've boarded some. They captured one ship and turned it into a sort of a museum on the waterfront. And this is ongoing. In response, the United States and the UK and the United Kingdom have actually organized a coalition in the Red Sea to try and keep the shipping open. And actually, after a number of these strikes, the US and UK actually have done major bombing runs into Yemen to attack Houthi military capabilities for the most part. Civilians have been killed in those strikes. And it's already, as I said, a humanitarian crisis situation. Unfortunately, the embargo on Yemen being imposed by the US and the UK are making things considerably worse for the population there. But nevertheless, the Houthis have actually done two things recently, over a month ago, was they sent a kind of kamikaze drone into Israel after the reports of some strike in Gaza that actually killed one person in Tel Aviv. And then they just did a hypersonic missile that they shot that landed in the middle of a desert in southern Israel, but they're trying to show they have capabilities. Okay, so that's the second front, Yemen. The third front is in northern Syria and northwestern Syria. And here we have a number of militias. Now, many people may not know this, or you may know this. Do you remember when ISIS took over northern Iraq and then was marching on Baghdad? And the United States rushed in, and actually in a very interesting alliance with Iran and pro-Iranian forces mobilized to drive ISIS out of Iraq and eventually into Syria, and then eventually took it into Syria, left behind, and also working with Kurdish forces. And in northern Syria, this area is primarily Kurdish areas, and the United States worked very closely with Kurdish fighters who were actually the most effective fighters against ISIS. Some of them were women-led units. And has maintained a kind of a number of forward operating bases in northern and northwestern Syria. If you look at a map, you can see why. Iran and its allies, the primary way they can get to Lebanon and Hezbollah or to get to Syria is they have to cross through western and northwestern Syria. So the United States clearly has its own geopolitical interests to stay. And what happened was after October 7th and the war in Gaza started, these militias started to take shots at American bases, trying to raise the costs. Again, not all the way, it's limited war. And then there was one attack, do you see down here, El Tanf garrison down here? You may remember this. There was one attack on what was called Tower 22 that killed 3 American soldiers and wounded about 16 to 20, I believe. And it's right on the edge of Jordan. The United States has a huge presence in Jordan, and El Tanf is the key area. In response, the Biden administration ended up attacking a number of these militia groups and actually took out a commander of one of these groups. So the U.S. has actually been engaged, again, low-level limited war. Let's go to the Iraqi front then. The Iraqi front, again, is militias, sub-state actors, often allied with Iran, who have their own axe to grind. One of the most notable is Kataib Hezbollah. You see it's the same name, Hezbollah. Kataib just means in Arabic brigades, the brigades of the Party of God. They're not the same as Hezbollah. They've got their own story. They're Iraqis. It's very different. They have their own sort of organizations. But they also, after the war in Gaza started, they said, we will raise the cost to the United States and to Israel, and we will try and do what we can in this broader second front. They also have other interests too, as every organization does. Primarily, they'd like to see the remaining U.S. forces leave Iraq. There's about 3,000 American soldiers still in Iraq left over from the ISIS campaign in a number of bases, including Al Assad base in the middle of Iraq. And they've been pushing to get the United States out of Iraq. And in fact, the current leader of Iraq has just been in negotiations, and it looks likely that they've made an agreement that the U.S. will leave 2 or 3 years from now. Whether that will appease these guys is unclear. But in some of those attacks, Americans were wounded in a number of attacks on these bases. And in one case, after that attack on the Tower 22, the Biden administration actually did a very major strike that took out one key commander. So you've actually had an exchange of low-level war with some of these actors. And what's interesting is that afterwards, Iran decided that it was time to lower the temperature, and they told Kataib Hezbollah to kind of drop it, and they did. So now we're to Iran. Well, Iran is a very large and powerful military actor. However, it's a very weak economic actor. Big divisions within Iran. If you follow the Middle East at all, you know that there are protests against the regime and the government in Iran, most recently led by a number of women's groups and organizations and others. So Iran is a very contested country. However, the key story when it comes to Iran is this, is that there's a state within a state, kind of like Hezbollah is in Lebanon. And within Iran, we have the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and they are a very powerful organization that sort of, in a sense, they run Iran's foreign policy at the military level. And they have a policy of what's called forward defense. In other words, to go back to the map here, their primary enemy is Israel, a nuclear-armed power, as they've had a long feud with for many years. And to some extent the United States, although that varies, sometimes more, sometimes less. But the way that they want to remain relevant and powerful, and again, I'm just being analytical here, telling the story, is they like to support various groups and militias, and you can see the names of these various groups, as a way of, if you want to come to us, you're going to have to go through these guys first. And if you want to use leverage against us in other ways, we might be able to turn the heat on here, turn the heat up here, and so on. This is sort of their strategy. But I want to be really clear here. Sometimes you'll hear in the American media that sort of every group is Iran-backed Houthis, the Iran-backed Hezbollah, the Iran-backed this or that, and so on and so forth. Yeah, at some level, but I just want, analytically speaking, these groups, think of it more as an alliance in which Iran is the senior partner, but these are not puppets, and Iran is not the puppet master, especially with Hezbollah. They are a very autonomous organization. They have multiple games they're playing, multiple strategies they're working in. Same with the Houthis. No one's going to dominate the Houthis, trust me. If you spend any time studying them, they will do what they want when they want. I would say the Iraqi militias are much tighter with Iran, and to some extent the Syrians. But so I just want to make that clear, though, that that's what's going on. It's my guess, and a lot of analysts that I take seriously, that, for example, when Hamas did the attack on Israel on October 7th, that Iran was not in on the deal, although they knew something was going to happen, but they didn't know what. And that has a lot of reasons why. I could go into it, but I mean, to be honest with you, probably the main reason was just, you're familiar with the concept of operational security, is just not to let it get out, right? Because Israel has very effective both human intel and electronic intel to be able to parse those things out. Plus, Hamas itself is a very independent actor. And I'm looking at our time, I could go on and on about all this stuff, but I just want to remind you this, though. You remember there was a Syrian civil war some years ago that led to the massive refugee crisis, 2015, 2016? Well, during the civil war, Syrian civil war, you had Hezbollah and Iran were the primary backers of the Syrian government under Bashar al-Assad, okay? The regime, the government there. Hamas and other groups actually supported the opposition to them. Now, here's a little bit of the Shia-Sunni split. Hamas was supporting its fellow Sunni forces, okay? And so Syria kicked Hamas out. And there's still a lot of bad blood there. So I just want you to understand that this is not all, the Middle East is complicated. It's a kaleidoscope. And every now and then, these things come together, just like the little toy. And then when they come together like they have now, Hamas now has sort of buried the hatchet, so have the Iranians, and even Hezbollah. But I just want you to understand that there are these tensions and dynamics. Okay. So for Iran, since October 7th, they have been quite happy to provide support, assistance, technology, etc., to those groups, to the Hezbollah, to the Houthis, to the Syrian militias, and to the Iraqi militias, and also every now and then to tell them, turn the heat down, turn it up, turn it down. And sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you can see it really happen. And that's their way of staying relevant. At the same time, it's been interesting. Iran has been in frequent contact with the US about limited war, saying, we don't want to go further here, we're not going to go further here. So it's been interesting. The French are often the mediators there. I don't know why. However, in April, Israel, here are the primary groups that I was mentioning, right? In April, Israel struck an Iranian diplomatic outpost in outside of Damascus. Well, it's Damascus, but then elsewhere, Aleppo, and killed a large number of Iranian officials, including some high IRGC people. And Iran just was like, we are going to respond. And again, everybody was like, I don't know if you remember this, but everybody was like, what's going to happen here? And it seemed clear that they didn't want to cross that red line. They wanted to stay, again, within the game that was being played. And so they kind of waited, and then they kind of signaled, and they sent some rockets and drones. It was the first ever strike against Israel from Iran, but it was fairly easily dealt with. I don't want to overstate that, but Israel and Jordan and the Saudis and the United States all kind of shot these down, and they landed without any casualties. I remember that it happened. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I remember thinking to myself, it looks like they wanted to make a symbolic act, but not necessarily a material act, because they didn't want to then provoke Israel to up it, right? To up it. And that's kind of the way this has been fought. And we're going to get to this. See, I made all my slides before everything has changed, and I sent it forward. Let's see if we want to skip ahead. Well, let's just say this. I'll lead to this, but since I have the slide up, I'll show you. This is part of this last month's escalation, and I'll get back to this. But this is Israel killing the number 2 Hezbollah leader, Fuad Shakr, and Israel killing the political head of Hamas. I'll get back here, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran. This is within the last month. Let's go ahead. So, what I've tried to do is lay out to you this second war that was happening over the past year. And I was going to make the argument that it's kind of interesting to see how it's held. And in fact, 2 months ago, I was actually thinking that there was going to be a ceasefire in Gaza based on my analysis of the powers that be and the players players in play, and that you're going to see then the reduction of tensions on these 5 fronts, because that's what they all said. And frankly, I think they have other interests. This is not their number one interest. The Houthis have other interests. They want to win the civil war in Yemen. The Iraqis want to, those militias and parties want to take over Iraq to make it into this pro-Iranian bastion. In Syria, you have the interest there. Assad, I think Putin is telling Assad, don't get involved in this. I got Ukraine, because he's the big backer of Syria. And Hezbollah, Lebanon's economy is crashing, and the political system is very fragile, and there's a lot of questions about Hezbollah's role in Lebanon by many Lebanese. So do you see what I'm getting at? There's a lot of mixed interests here, and my sense was once you get the Gaza ceasefire, which I thought was going to happen, then you're going to see the decline in this, and then we were going to be dealing with a whole different set of issues. Well, that hasn't happened. And that's where I get to the sort of the final part of my broader story here. The primary driver now that has escalated on all these fronts, but particularly in the Lebanese front, has been Israel. So it's very interesting to look at and think about. The Israeli government, and I want to be clear here, we say Israel, but really I'm talking about the Israeli government, and I'll explain a little bit more about who those actors are and what their interests are, because I think it's really important for us not to generalize about all these countries and to make sure we're being very clear about which actors and agents, because that's just how it works. And that's with all these groups too, by the way. So here's what's happened in the last month. During ceasefire negotiations about the Lebanon border that was being led by the United States, Amos Hochstein, it's a really interesting story. He's an Israeli-American who was like the lead envoy in Beirut, in Lebanon, in Israel, etc. Biden administration team. He shows up in Israel. We think we're getting a deal, maybe with Hezbollah. We got pressure. Israel assassinates number 2 leader of Hezbollah, Fuad Shakar, blows up a building in Dahia in the southern Beirut. This is number 2 to Nasrallah. Okay, and then within a week, negotiations over a ceasefire in Gaza, and the lead Palestinian in the outside is Ismail Haniyeh, former main leader in Gaza. Assassinate him in Tehran. Just think about that. And it was a very complicated operation. Apparently left a bomb in the room where they knew he was going to be. Very sophisticated operation. In Tehran, the day the new Iranian president was being sworn in. This is incredible. When I saw that, I was like, oh, I think we're headed into a new ballgame here. I think something is changing now. Because basically it meant that neither, from their perspective, the opportunity was more important than the negotiations. And again, we could read that in different ways. I have my reading. Maybe some other people disagree. But then what we had was we had increasing strikes in Lebanon, hitting key special forces leaders amongst Lebanese in southern Lebanon. And that was ramping up. And then, of course, last week, or I can't even tell the days anymore, but you had this really stunning pager explosion with this crazy operation that I think the Israeli intelligence agency, the Mossad, did, which is that they got into Hezbollah's. Well, first, I think they killed Fuad Shakar, that guy, the number 2, I think because of his cell phone. I think they'd broken into his cell phone, and then Nasrallah had a big, televised broadcast. We get rid of our cell phones. We're going to be using pagers. And then Israel already kind of had that mapped out. And anyway, 5,000 pagers. They planted explosive devices, apparently some front group in Bulgaria or Hungary. I still don't quite understand it all. And then they exploded them one day after another in a really, an astonishingly and I think really dangerous way, which was you didn't know who was holding it at what time anyway. I guess they're telling us, oh, they're all hardened Hezbollah operatives. Sorry, that's not the case, but they killed, I think, 40 plus people, injured thousands, blew out eyes, blew out hands. Many ended up being maimed with that. But anyway, the point is, it's a major escalation. Obviously, it's a huge blow to Hezbollah. But again, when you see something like that, I know there's some discussion that maybe they thought Hezbollah had figured it out, so they might as well use it. That's been an argument I've heard. I don't know if you've heard that, but I've heard that by some pretty credible people. Nevertheless, you still wouldn't do it. You don't need to do it unless it's part of a broader campaign of escalation, is the way I read it. So we had this attack, and then of course, in the past few days, we've had major strikes, and this is now where we are right now. Major strikes across southern Lebanon, and Hezbollah has started to respond in kind. However, it's not quite fully escalated into a bigger war. So what is going on here? Well, from a strictly sort of, if I just stick on the surface here, from a military kind of strategy level, it's clear to me that Israel is seeking to change the equation. They want out of this limited war. They want to use coercive, I'm going to use language of military here. They want to use coercive violence to punish Hezbollah, to raise the cost, to have it remove its forces from Israel's border, or to agree to a negotiated deal that it will remove itself from Israel's border so that Israel can return its 70,000 civilians back up to the border towns and villages. Okay, that's the technical kind of thing that is in play here. I think strategically, it feels to me like what they're trying to do is box Hezbollah into a corner, because if it does not respond, if it does not do this, if it does not withdraw its forces and away from the border zone, then Israel will continue to escalate and force Hezbollah to respond. And if Hezbollah responds in a really serious way, hits civilians and so on, then Israel can claim self-defense. And then perhaps you will see a ground incursion and Israel creating a buffer zone. And this would be the idea. Israel has pulled back most of its population from these areas, so it's down below. And the idea, I think the military idea, and you have to understand in Israel, the military's got these guys, the political guys got these guys, would be to create at least a zone that's free of Hezbollah so that they could return back up to this zone, okay? But I think they're goading Hezbollah into, they're trying to box them in. They're gambling, big time. But what's really going on at a deeper level? And this is what I'm trying to think through, and I'll think through out loud with you, and we can discuss it later. I like to read the Israeli press. I've lived in Israel many times. I read the Arab press too. I like to read the analysts and the military thinkers and then the political analysts and the others. And this is sort of my take, and then we'll see where this goes. I think what we have to ask ourselves, one is the timing, why now? Because it's very clear to me that this is not something that Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthis, or the militias in Iraq were wanting. I think they liked having this heat on Israel. It made them look good. It was their contribution to the effort. They thought it was pressuring the United States and Israel and so on. So this is not like after October 7th when they were invaded and massacres happened and hostages were taken. This is not immediate self-defense. This is a war of choice. Secondly, if they want to return their civilians back to the northern borders, it's pretty clear to me, ceasefire in Gaza. That's a story, and they were very close about a month and a half, 2 months ago. So something else seems to be going on here, and here's my read on it. I think in some ways we have to really think about the current Israeli government and its composition, with the leadership of Bibi Netanyahu. I'll go a little further here. And then his government is composed of probably the most extremist government in Israel's history, honestly. If you know anything about Israel, I've lived there many times, you know the players here. Bezalel Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and one of the leaders of the settler movement. And these guys are the far right in Israel. Netanyahu's to their left, and Netanyahu's always been part of the revisionist wing of Zionism, okay? And I think what's going on is that they've made a new calculation. And here it is. I think this is a kind of bait and switch. And what I mean by that is, I think we have to understand that Israel has actually not achieved, on its own terms, okay? I'm not putting other perspective, on its own terms, the complete destruction and eradication of Hamas was the goal that Benjamin Netanyahu, they call him Bibi, so I'll use that, Benjamin Netanyahu, let's say. Israel has failed to achieve its maximalist goals. It has failed a victory. It's been unsuccessful in this. It has destroyed 85% of Gaza. It has killed a large number of people. It's incredibly controversial. I don't need to get into all that, but I'm sure you're aware of all that. But I'm trying to give you the facts here. Hamas has not been defeated. They still have capabilities, and every time Israel leaves a certain zone that they've just taken over and they leave, Hamas comes back and imposes some form of rule. I mean, this is from the Israeli media, okay? I'm telling you, read Haaretz, for example, or read other Israeli sources. The hostages have not been returned. In fact, most of them are dead now. But there's about, I don't know, 50, 60 left. Tell me what the numbers are that you've heard. And there's incredible pressure from the Israeli public to go for a ceasefire. The Israeli public is really going hard on Netanyahu. They want the remaining hostages home. They want a ceasefire. You've seen them in the streets. And I think this government is not interested in that. I think the government wants to finish the goals that they set out at the beginning, and they want to maintain, and they've recommitted in a sense to total victory. And I mean, again, this is my best read on it, and I'm sharing it with you. And I also think that they have a desire to maintain some kind of permanent rule in Gaza after this war. And any kind of ceasefire was going to need to make concessions to the Palestinians that they could play some role in the future of Gaza. And I don't think this government has that interest. I'll explain a little bit more later. So since it doesn't want that, and yet there's also huge clamoring from within Israel, these 70,000 people who were, I think, wrongly driven from their homes, I accept that. However, they want to go back to their homes. They are also a political force in Israel. And do you see what I'm getting at? In other words, let's continue the war, and we can open up another front, because then people aren't looking at the war in Gaza anymore. They're now looking at the other front, and if we're successful, we can get our people back. The military plays an interesting role here. I think they're mixed about it. Right after October 7th, a kind of unity war cabinet was created. You had Netanyahu, but then you had Yossi Gallant, and you had, sorry, I'm just blanking right now. This would be the guy that if there was an election, he'd probably, it's pretty close, but he'd probably beat Netanyahu. Someone remembers his name. Sorry. He's a former general, a very significant figure. Not Yair Lapid. Sorry, just we'll think about it again. They're all gone now. There's no guardrails. It's Bibi, it's Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and the group. Gallant is kind of on the edges. And Netanyahu is trying to push him out too. And he's disbanded the war cabinet, okay? The military is mixed. Some of them don't want this second front. They know they're not prepared. They know that they've had a really hard time in Gaza. Many of them are pushing for a ceasefire. Again, politics is always complicated. However, there are some factions within the military at the highest level who really want to make up for the catastrophic failure of October 7th for failing to protect Israel from the Hamas terror attack. It's a huge issue in Israel. Day after this, there are going to be massive investigations, lots of action about it. It's like 9/11, right? Who failed 9/11? And the shoddy performance in Gaza itself. And the Israeli military has been planning since 2006 to find a way to defeat Hezbollah in a way to restore, there's two ways of thinking about it, restore their honor, but in their mind, if you follow Israeli military discussions, they want to restore deterrence. They want to be a feared force. That's been the central doctrine of Israeli military from the beginning, is we need to be feared. We have to have deterrence power. If you ever look at the way Israeli military and other figures talk about it, they're always like, we have to restore deterrence. And then lastly, if we can be more cynical, Benjamin Netanyahu himself, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but if his coalition collapses and he leaves office, he will be under criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement, and likely will have jail time. Now, I'm stressing I actually think the other issues are more important here, but I think this has to be on the table. And his coalition, I've been studying what's been happening in the West Bank right now, which is a kind of another front that has been opened up. And these two guys basically have tried to figure out a way to make it so they are ruling the West Bank now and all the settlements in the West Bank. And they're very clear in their ideology is they do not ever want to see a possibility for a Palestinian state. Okay, they're very clear, and they want to settle as many Israelis into. They definitely have an interest for the war to continue, new fronts to open up. They don't want to see this end. So that's the very cynical read. And for those guys, we call them religious Zionism, although Ben-Gvir is actually part of a neo-fascist party called Jewish Power. It was from Kahana from a long time ago. Okay. And some of them actually want to build settlements in Gaza. Ben-Gvir's crowd, they want to push Palestinians permanently out of the north and rebuild settlements there. Okay, let's get to the final part of the story. What's up with the U.S.? What's the U.S. doing in this? And again, I'm giving you my analysis. I may be right, I may be wrong. We may agree, we may disagree. It's fine. I think the question with the U.S. is this. The U.S. could stop this if it wants right now. It could have stopped the Gaza war if it wanted, okay? We have to be clear about that. This great political scientist, Ian Lustig, has written this really good piece where he shows every war Israel has fought has always ended when the U.S. said, you're now starting to threaten our broader strategic interests, time to stop. Because the U.S. is a very close ally with Israel, has usually supported it, but at a certain point, there's a point where it tells Israel to stop. And it hasn't done so. And it could have done so now. So the question is, really, and this is what, in my circles, what we've been debating a lot, because it's been kind of confusing, honestly, maybe for you as well, is does the dog wag the tail, or does the tail wag the dog? In other words, the dog being the U.S., Israel being the tail. Which way is it? What explains this? So does the dog wag the tail would be basically are the U.S. and Israel aligned in their strategic interests. The U.S. has basically been in favor of the Gaza war, have wanted this sort of maximalist war. Is it now in favor of Israel's apparent escalation now with Hezbollah and Lebanon? Like, is it on board and basically feels that Israel is a strategic asset to the United States? Does that make sense? And hence the support, the diplomatic support, the weapons, and so on and so forth. Or does the tail wag the dog, meaning that Israel's playing the U.S., that Israel has certain assets, especially in an election year, this would be the argument, that you don't want to turn on us because this will turn on you. Obviously, there are pro-Israel lobbies that are very powerful, but don't leave aside the Christian Zionist community. You know, the Christian communities are very pro-Israel. And the way these folks are able to mobilize power and influence. So which is it? I think it's a little bit of both, but primarily I think there's a strategic interest that's behind this. And here's the kind of last part of the story I want to tell you that most people don't understand, that I think we should really be thinking about. Right before October 7th, the Biden administration was going to unveil their huge foreign policy initiative that was going to be the game changer of the Middle East. I'm not sure you guys were aware of this, maybe you are. And this was a Saudi-Israel deal. A new Middle East would be created. And they were very close. The idea was that, that Saudi would recognize Israel and they would have a normalization treaty. This is massive. The United States would have a near NATO-type security agreement with Saudi. That's the payoff to the Saudis to make the deal with Israel. Also supporting them with a civilian nuclear program. And allowing them access to the highest level weapons, which is previously denied because it's always wanted to give Israel what they call the quantitative military edge, QME. And out of this, Israel, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, all of these countries would then now have a normalization relationship with Israel, and we've got a new Middle East. Because these other countries are already on board with Israel. The Saudis would bring the rest along, maybe even the rest of many of the Muslim world. The only people that wouldn't would be Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran, and the Iraqi Shiite militias. You see where I'm going with this? So the idea here from the Biden administration perspective is this would be the grand bargain. Then finally, we can get out of the Middle East. We can have an offshore strategy. That's what they call it in international relations theory. We can offshore it. We can balance from abroad. These guys will now, this Middle Eastern NATO will now kind of do the defense work in the region. Israeli technology and military prowess, Saudi money and bankrolling, the UAE, they're trying to build their weapons industry, etc. US can get out and focus, make the pivot to Asia, if you remember this from Obama administration. So we'd have kind of like this new alliance. And here's the capper to this was, as a result, you could create this new IMEC, it was called, where you could get India involved. They could ship to United Arab Emirates, Dubai, train through Saudi, go through Jordan, come out of the port at Haifa, and you've got this new corridor. Why does that matter? What's China doing right now? China's doing the Belt and Road Initiative, which is all about an economic corridor across the heartland of Asia, right? So you have now matched China. Do you see why they were getting excited about this? I believe that that was behind the primary reason why the US, why Biden flew into Israel after October 7th. Look, leaving aside obvious sympathy for people and victims of the attack and so on and so forth, and Biden has a personal history with Israel, etc., but why they agreed to the military response that they agreed to and have supported all along was I think they believed that by supporting Israel, that a time would come where Israel, then even this right-wing government, would be like, you stood with us against Hamas, we took them out, now we'll join this deal. Do you see the arrangement here? At least that's my analysis, okay? But there's one variable that's tricky here. The Saudis have said that will only come with a Palestinian state or some kind of Palestinian independence. We don't know exactly what they mean. I have a sense of what they mean. And of course, from this government's perspective, they have no interest in it. For their own reasons, you may agree or disagree. I'm just telling you that's the story. So why then have they supported the Gaza war and then the escalation right now? I think in some ways is that they have this Biden administration is they feel that, well, in a way, Israel has seriously diminished two of the main obstacles to the new Middle East, Hamas and possibly Hezbollah. They're hoping they could keep it within from spiraling into a regional war. And then in the long run, eventually there'll be a new Israeli government that will finally come around and agree that it's time for the new Middle East. Because obviously Israel will benefit greatly by this, economically, let me just tell you. So it's kind of shocking that Israel hasn't gone along with this from the beginning, because it's a pretty sweet deal for them, I'm just saying. I'm not sure if it ultimately would have ever been a good deal for Palestinians, and that's a different story. So to get to the final part of the story then, is we're left here, which is my own perspective on this, which is I'm very concerned about this escalation. I think we might be on the road to crossing a line here. If Hezbollah starts hitting Israeli targets, I think Israel goes full, and then Hezbollah is going to have to go full, and then maybe the Iranians will get involved. Houthis apparently are sending some of their people into Syria. The Iraqis are now figuring out how to do drones at Israel, and so on. And the problem here is not just that I don't like conflict or war or something like that, but it's that I don't see it benefiting any of the actors in the long run. If there's any lesson we learned from post-9/11 war on terror issue, it's that military force is only good for a few things. It's good for changing maybe a status quo. It's good for blowing up a lot of things. It's good for to use a terrible expression, mowing the lawn for a while. But the thing is if you don't have a political alternative and a political aspect, read your Clausewitz, there has to be a political endgame to your military strategy, then it will always come back. And here the issue is Hezbollah will never go away. It just won't. It's too deeply embedded. It comes out of a social movement in Lebanon. Iran won the war on terror. They're always going to be a powerful player in Iraq. The Houthis are not going away. And at the end of the day, the Palestinian issue cannot be disappeared. It will be there. It's not going to go away. You can't defeat that militarily. So that's what I'm concerned about. And I feel like we could go back to the basics, which if you really want this to end, you have to figure out a ceasefire in Gaza. This is the linchpin, and I'll just mention this to you. If you want sort of a mainstream analysis, who I think hits the nail on the head, Stephen Simon, former member of the National Security Council, this is a piece in New York Times. He wrote a book called Grand Delusion, The Rise and Fall of American Ambition in the Middle East. I've looked through it pretty closely. He's really smart. I think he gets a lot of this. We all have our different politics and so on and so forth, but from an analysis thing, I think he's right. And he basically says that it's time for the US to step up and actually think long-term strategic, and actually it's going to have to stop this sooner rather than later because the consequences would be too severe. Washington needs to make it clear it won't sanction an escalation. And then he says at the end, beyond the ongoing limited diplomacy and so on, ceasefire in Gaza is the surest way to diffuse the tensions in the north and elsewhere. This is now a race against the clock. So now I'm bringing in my own perspective. I agree with Simon, and only a fool would predict the future. Let's see. We'll have to see what happens here. So thank you very much.
That was Professor Stephen Niva in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with KTOO. It was recorded September 25th, 2024 at KTOO in Juneau. JWAC presentations are supported by season sponsor Core Alaska Kensington Mine, with additional support by DreamHost.com and individual contributors.